Do this once, and you decide how they will see you for years. It might seem far-fetched. We often believe that reputation develops gradually through consistent behavior and dedicated effort. This view is appealing as it suggests fairness and implies that time is on our side. The story is comforting, but the data does not really support it. Back in 1946, Solomon Asch designed a straightforward but insightful experiment. Participants received a list of personality traits describing an individual. One version started with intelligent, followed by industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. Another version presented the exact same traits, only in reverse order. The only change was the sequence. Yet, this small change dramatically shifted participants' impressions. When intelligent was listed first, the person was deemed capable, albeit with flaws. Conversely, when envious appeared first, the same person was seen as problematic and challenging to deal with. The initial adjective did more than just add data. It shaped the understanding of all subsequent traits. Asch called this a primacy influence. The first frame established the perspective through which everything else was viewed. I recall witnessing this influence firsthand during a corporate meeting. A newly appointed department head began his introduction with a joke about removing inefficiencies. While the remark seemed harmless and drew laughter, the term removing stuck in people's minds. Soon, even routine choices were viewed as part of a larger restructuring effort. Months later, when the department head reorganized teams, employees didn't consider the logic behind the changes. Instead, they referred back to his initial comment, claiming he warned us. The reality was that he had not planned any such thing. He had simply set a frame, which others then filled in with their own interpretations. While standard psychology suggests that impressions are constantly updated, updating them requires cognitive effort. Truthfully, many people are already mentally exhausted. In 1996, Nalini Ambady and Robert Rosenthal showed something they called thin slicing. Students watched brief, silent video clips of teachers, some lasting only 2 seconds. From these short glimpses, they rated the teacher's competence and warmth. Surprisingly, these ratings accurately predicted end-of-semester reviews from students who had worked with those teachers for months. 2 seconds were enough. No actual course content was present. All that was there were posture, pace, and subtle facial expressions. When I first heard this, I was surprised by how strong the link was. It was unsettling. That is where the traditional theory starts to break down. We often think meaningful judgment comes from gathering data. In practice, people's brains jump to form stories immediately, then look for evidence to back them up. That search for confirmation doesn't feel like bias. It feels like normal perception. This is especially clear on social media. A company founder might post a single insensitive tweet. Within hours, screenshots are everywhere. Headlines start to paint a picture of the founder as arrogant, out of touch, or irresponsible. Investors start asking new questions. The original incident shapes how journalists cover the story going forward. Even actions that would normally be seen as generous are now viewed with suspicion. I saw this play out in 2018 with a tech executive who spoke dismissively about disruption during a round of layoffs. The clip was widely shared, missing the broader situation. Whether the layoffs had a valid strategic reason became irrelevant. The narrative was now that he was heartless. Everything that came after seemed to support that view. The halo effect helps make this influence even stronger. In 1920, Edward Thorndike found that military leaders who were highly rated on one trait were also highly rated on other, unrelated traits. If a soldier was seen as physically strong, he was also considered more intelligent and a better leader. Many years later, this effect is still seen. In hiring studies, Candidates who are viewed as attractive are often also rated as more competent. In studies about leadership, a person who shows confidence early on might be mistaken as someone with deep understanding. A single trait that is easy to see can influence how people feel about all other traits. Often, new employees find themselves affected by the halo effect without knowing it. A new analyst might offer a well-organized talk during her first week. Her slides are clear, her voice is steady, and she makes good eye contact. Right away, she is labeled as someone with high potential. If she makes a mistake 3 months later, it will be seen as an odd one-off incident. Another analyst may struggle during his first talk. He hesitates and loses his place. He is then seen as unprepared. Later, when he puts out sound work, managers comment that he is improving. The actual quality of their work might be the same, but how it is framed isn't. People like to believe that in the end, the quality of our work wins out over how we appear. Sometimes it does, but only after initial impressions have grown strong. And that strongness is key. Once that initial idea is there, everything that you do after that is viewed through the lens of that idea. It's the unspoken thing that nobody talks about. This pattern not only changes how people view leaders, it shapes how workers act too. If a boss is known for strictly enforcing deadlines from the start, employees will start to carefully manage themselves. They will double-check emails. They will arrive early. They will assume any unclear comments are a sign of high expectations. However, if a boss seems casual from the beginning, the team will relax, try new things, and maybe push limits. The boss might think they're only showing their personality. In truth, they're setting up how other people will think and act. I used to think that first impressions were not something that lasted. I felt solid facts could easily prove those impressions wrong. However, studies on how people hold onto their beliefs show that often isn't so. After a convincing story takes hold, people often adjust any facts that go against that story instead of accepting the facts at face value. In one well-known series of tests in the 1970s, Lee Ross and his group gave people false feedback on how well they could tell apart real suicide notes from fake ones. Even after the people learned the feedback was made up, many of them went on believing what their initial level of skill was. The first label stayed stuck. Giving correct data didn't remove it. That leads to an uncomfortable idea. If how people see you locks in early, the person who sets the initial frame has power in changing how people will view future actions. You don't have to control everything that happens. You do need to shape the story people tell themselves from the beginning. After that, the system will keep itself going. This is where Machiavelli's ideas start to feel less cold and more insightful. In The Prince, he wrote that people judge more by what they see than what they feel because everyone can see, but few can feel. He wasn't promoting lies. He was stating how our minds naturally work. Most observers won't try to understand your deepest reasons. They will attach themselves to the first obvious sign and build their ideas out from there. I keep coming back to a question that psychology seems to treat like a minor thing. If we understand that first impressions are so strong, that quick glances predict long-term judgments, and that the halo effect taints how we judge, why do we keep pretending that everyone will be judged fairly? Maybe the reason is that the alternative makes power seem too easy to get. If power comes not from force or money, but from setting the frame, then the first thing you do in any relationship, whether it be at work, in politics, or in your personal life, has a huge effect. It's strange, but true. What feels like just a simple hello may already be the most important turning point. So who gets to make that first impression? And what if taking the lead isn't about forcing others, but about getting to decide where the story starts? If the first move shapes the story, then the real battle isn't about actions. It's about what those actions mean. It's not about what happened, it's about what that happening is called. In 1981, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky released a study with a finding that seems almost too simple to be true. They asked people to decide between different medical treatments for a disease outbreak that was expected to kill 600 people. One way the possible outcome was framed was the treatment would save 200 lives. The other way was the treatment would let 400 people die. In both cases, the math was the same. Yet, most people chose a course of action based on how the outcome was described. When actions were stated as lives saved, people chose the sure thing. When they were stated as deaths, they decided to take the risk. The only thing that changed was the frame. When I first heard this, I saw it as describing how humans see risk, not what is good or bad. The longer I gave it thought, the more uneasy that difference felt. The reason is that effect isn't just about health decisions. It has control over reputations. Consider if a boss cuts 10% of their staff. In one email, it is written as a strategic restructuring to ensure long-term resilience. In another email, one that gets out to the press, it's called mass layoffs driven by executive overexpansion. It's the same event. It's the same numbers. It creates a different feel. Workers reading the first email may be nervous, but will feel that have the same goals as the company. Reading the second, they feel betrayed. The number of people cut is the same. However, the way it is put changes whether people stay with the company or not. Political campaigns have improved this to an art. In 2004, during the United States presidential election, the phrase flip-flopper became strongly linked to John Kerry. The expression changed how people viewed how he slightly shifted his ideas on problems as showing weakness. From then on, anytime he tried to explain his point, the label became stronger. In 2016, expressions like law and order or build the wall did not lay out clear policies. Those phrases framed events. People who backed them and who were against them started reading every speech through those key phrases. The precise details had less meaning than the overall narrative frame. Language is used like building blocks. I once saw a performance review fall apart over a single word. A senior manager called a female team leader aggressive. The word was intended as praise for her drive. But in the room, I saw people look tense. Later, in whispers, those same acts were called abrasive. Meanwhile, a man who showed the same level of drive was called decisive and strong-willed. The study of people has shown that this can happen. Studies on how gender affects leadership reviews shows that the exact same behaviors can create different words. What shocks me is how little the people doing it recognize it. Nobody thinks they are twisting what happened. They think they are calling it as they see it. The theory says framing happens because humans use mental shortcuts. That explanation is correct, but it doesn't connect to feelings. The reason is that framing becomes a means to get something. In 2009, during the economic crisis, several banks called government bailouts liquidity support. The term made their dependency on government seem like a short-term help. I watched emails inside one European bank at the time. Employees were told the support was a stabilization measure. The public instead heard critics call it a taxpayer rescue. The staff of the bank kept their spirits up, while many people were angry. The money was the same. However, how people understood it shaped what was seen as correct. That it were simply seeing things as they are falls apart as a belief system. We like to trust that we see events as they are. Lee Ross, in the 1970s, described this simply seeing things as the conviction that we view the world fairly, and people who don't agree with us are misinformed or biased. However, framing test shows that what we see isn't like a neutral camera. It is more like a narrator. And narrators choose a point of view. Long before the science of the mind was understood, Machiavelli understood something important. He notes that a leader should seem kind, true, nice, religious, even if he isn't any of those things. Critics have taken that to mean that he was in favor of being two-faced. I'm not sure that's right. It's simply seeing how things happen to be. If you set the impression first, later actions will be viewed a certain way. Think about the contrast between he is confident and he is arrogant. The behavior that is a strong tone, direct eye contact, little hesitation is just the same. But if the first thought is that they're competent, that behavior shows leadership. If the first thought is that they're overly impressed by themselves, it signals they are a risk. I have witnessed teams break down because of this occur in real time. A new manager starts a meeting and stops someone to fix a specific detail. Half the room nods, viewing them as clear in their thinking. The other half feels they're acting strong. Usually that comes from how the manager was put in place. Turnaround specialist as opposed to political appointee. The wording decides the moral reading ahead of time. Here is something that is hardly ever said out loud. If the frame is accepted, events are used to defend that frame. Looking at how media covers corporate problems, researchers have proven that the first headlines change the tone of what is said or written later. An initial story that refers to a business as innovative but controversial makes later events seem like strong risk-taking. An initial story stating it as reckless sets the stage for later coverage that expresses irresponsibility. Reporters may not be conspiring. They're simply working inside already set borders of information. For common employees, the above is not a theory. It will have a huge effect on their ability to get through the day. If your boss gains the early image of demanding but fair, a tough email seems like high standards. If viewed as unstable, the same email creates a sense of fear. Tension differs. What people decide to do in their careers shifts. Workers update their resumes not because of new events, but in response to how those events are understood. A clever player starts to see that acting in a different way is costly. Changing how things are understood is less so. If you can plant the idea from the beginning, you do not have to keep defending yourself later. You don't need to lie. It comes down to order. Bring up the rule ahead of the exception. Show that you're good before handing out punishment. State the goal you're seeking before needing people to make sacrifices. Here is where right and wrong becomes tricky. If framing shapes moral judgment, then language can strengthen or weaken virtue. A tax increase then becomes investment in public goods. A surveillance program becomes enhanced security. Strong police action is restoring order. Every term asks for a different emotional response, even prior to looking at the facts. I did not expect framing to feel like it does when I first studied it. I assumed facts would, in the end, have more influence. However, during tough times with businesses, during political races, during storms on social media, the first lens will more than likely outlive facts that are the total opposite. So the question turns sharper. If reality is filtered through the narrative, and that narrative is placed on purpose, then what really has power? What is done, or the story that's told about it first? And if one can decide on the story early, where do we still argue of truth, or merely whose creative frame wins? Should the story win before the facts are presented? Something else must be occurring beneath the surface. Given that even when new facts turn up, people hardly ever change the narrative. They instead protect it. They will freeze you in point in time. One explanation is that we can only think about so much at once. In 1956, George Miller said the human mind can hold about 7 things in its short-term memory, give or take. Research later brought those numbers down. The correct number is argued. However, the limit is known. Trying to understand complex information uses energy. Changing beliefs requires energy. In business, that energy is not there. I saw this clearly as part of business that gave advice, where performance reviews happen twice per year. In the time following the first meetings, everyone was labeled with different words. Reliable, brilliant but chaotic, not leadership material. These words were never put in writing. Nevertheless, they spread from person to person among partners. Half a year later, when new info came, improved numbers, successful projects, the talks did not start fresh. They started with the word from before. New facts were understood with that previous label in mind. Psychologists describe this as confirmation bias. In 1979, Charles Lord, Lee Ross, and Mark Lepper performed a study on capital punishment. Those that stood for it or were against it were shown mixed facts, some tests showing it as helpful, while others showed it as unhelpful. As opposed to people merging more, participants became more set in their beliefs. They saw supportive research as well done and opposing research as poor. Those test data made strong the opposite views. This process seems not an act of stubbornness from the inside. It seems like a fair way to read things. That is what makes it so strong. Belief holding on keeps it moving forward. During one classic test by Ross and his group from the 1970s, people were given made-up feedback on their social abilities. Some were told they were good at understanding others. Some were told they did poorly. Later, the researchers came clean that the feedback was false. Fairly, the beliefs should have disappeared. They did not. Participants went on believing things in line with what the original feedback was. Even after the source of what was informing them broke down, the building had already took shape. I did not believe that holding to a belief would be so strong when I first read those findings. Here, theory promises flexibility. In practice, identity refuses change. Social categorization research explains a reason for this. Henri Tajfel's small group test in the 1970s showed that people made groups based on small differences even when they were random. Once categorized, people were seen less as all complex, but more as a stand-in for a thing. Category simplifies reality. This reduces the need to think hard. Moving it to business world, this change becomes what moves things forward. A new hire is viewed in short term as high skill. If that person proposes an ambitious plan, managers would call them visionary. Another hire from another school would recommend the same thing and told to be realistic. Content is the same. What changes the idea depends, however. Changing the group requires effort. It means recognizing that the quick thinking wasn't right. That creates mixed messages, a thought Leon Festinger offered in 1957. When faced with info that does not fit what you believed, discomfort happens. One thing to do is adjust the old belief. The other thing to do is change the way you see the info. I saw this play out. One manager was marked as hard to deal and reliably delivered projects ahead of what they were set to. Instead of changing the hard to deal label, people called her efficient as controlling. Achieving success did not change that idea. It was consumed by it. Changing the impression meant knowing that that first decision was made fast. The process becomes strategic at this point. Once you're labeled, you become something with quick uses. Others do not have to read you with much thought. They pull up the shortcut for you. Being in high-tense environments, this shortcuts is rewarded. Decision needs to be made fast. Shortcuts help make it happen quickly, but fast favors the well-known more than the fair. Studies show similar things. An oil spill damaged what people thought of BP by a strong amount. Years went by. Even after fixing the area, the company did not do well compared to competitors. Analysts showed that once a company become linked to harm, to planet all after that were taken with a grain of salt. The first words shape people impressions. For the common person, being frozen in a short term is hurtful. The analyst who is labeled good at detail never gets to shape plans. Colleagues who may have been written off as creative are never put in positions where they can show the skills as leaders. They have resistance when they seek to show a side that isn't seen. The label become what happens and keeps happening, not because what they're really like, but as people have written them off. is something that is hardly spoke about. Fairly doesn't happen in practice. Keeping the social is the real driver. A stable plan reduces not knowing. Knowing allows plans to be made. Is where Machiavellian's sense shows slowly. If humans are against changing impression because it is costly planting, it early has real power that lasts. The person that does that plants a long-term shortcut to other people's brain. Then what really happens is in battle with the most easy to see way of things. I used to trust that doing well could always fix the past. At times that does happen. Research say that not to be. Getting stuff done will not be real, but support other things or requires the cost of fixing other bad thoughts. Most people aren't going to get there. Freezing is not some kind of accident. It is a structure. One become not known because one lacks something because others have written you. If people are locked down to the first idea, the question begins to turn stronger. Who create that idea? Who will be willing to change how it happens or is seen? Should identity freeze simply as it's the easiest way? What is the purpose of other trying to get the real you be seen? Instead, you can act on the signal, but not only that you can choose what you stand for. Intent will show what's in the shot. Construction. Machiavelli wrote that rulers should avoid being nice and use what being known when to use it. It is said often as a proof that there is no worry about right and wrong. What gets me more is the observation that humans judge more by looks than by experience. All can see looks and few experience. I used to see is as what happens, however, now is has a reason. If impressions freeze fast and are against change, then looks aren't what you are known for, but what gets most done. Consider Satya Nadella getting to Microsoft, the company, then didn't adapt as fast as it should have. Now Satya has offered others away on his first show of caring, with those with his family, including raising a child that has high needs. Internally, he made a memo featuring learning. The effort showed he cared for his team. In time, this created a different way. What he did after were like what happened with people with the previous leader. However, the result was more positive. I didn't see empathy playing a major role. However, it shows the best side. He made a claim that the way the company would operate through learning, then there would be a feeling of power. This narrowed the range in between what he might be thinking and what was obvious. Looking what happens first is not the result of someone introducing themselves. It is the result of showing status. Set up what would be accepted and give the company value. Status doesn't have to put the other down. Jeff showed to people on Congress that he held value to his company. To others, he did not want to show himself as weak. By talking in a calm manner, the other showed that he could resist pressure and not give in. They gave other internally the energy to follow their leadership. To make a set of what is to be expected happens with what happens first. Not that often an appointment in a firm would turn down a manager. What to be expected were to be done with help from test results. Then what he expected did not last long. Test to see how far he went when he tested others. What is greatly shown happens often in image and name. High-profile wins shape what everyone knows greatly. Tests have shown that people with high profile are shown to have an increased chance of chances. That what the task showed by the managers at the time. Knowing this, some will negotiate to have their name known, then to combine what they were. It may appear a goal. It is done on purpose. One will want to state facts as part of that. Well, the ones known will respond. Facts show the what will happen in sequence. The social mood isn't waiting. Everything on the spot, others will write you to what they want. If what others call you will have a heavy weight on the future. Made vulnerability shows the amount of stress. A known fatigue and honest about what went wrong was stated in interviews. To help show that people can link and work to what can keep what is their solid. What happened by action. To send a message to voters who can remain in their places than other thing has to seen. Known acting in a way so others can see creates ability to plan what will go down. A known business leader let go of their workers for not linking with other workers that worked with them. The words were open, and without that relationship, work meant nothing. Over time, it was thought the investors did not like the move. Connection went up the other was made, fast the first to take action, cut down on talk that has to be made, which is to never fall as what you will say, but to arrange on where you stand today. A leader that doesn't stop thinking of a plan knows that when things have been set as a tool, you can take away the other stuff and run with that with what is known with action. What is not that clear is the ability to work, and that the known is better than what it's stated. To work to get the other should have feelings about with the frame it's told. It shouldn't tell the reader what it all is. It needs a new plan. For an everyday person, what has came about builds what they do. A manager first to make known that has set everything at its peak with little emails coming in. If a manager state that they lack a barrier to request what takes up a lot of time, what that would affect the manager or the business. Actions show their side to the community. What went wrong can go back to their is. What someone creates can influence more what that other person made known from small action. That it has now been put to have the building be made clear. Is the first symbol sets what will be with everything that will be understand the facts will be. How to work on what you plan will have to what you known for or not what is on paper. It's a what the real thoughts, not how something is really. You can now have what is what you see has shift. What is that design start as before has can start as something risky. The question has stopped being how to plan the sign. What point does show what we do turn it wrong? Is shaping other impression, making someone agree, or just helping them get through the day? In the 1950s, Irving Goffman put forward the idea that our social lives play out as a series of performances. His book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, details how we are always managing the impressions we give off. We adjust our tone, posture, and what we reveal about ourselves based on who we are with. This might seem obvious, it is something we all do. For example, most people would agree that one speaks to a client differently than they would to a sibling. Yet, Goffman did not make any ethical judgments. He only described the stage without talking about when these performances cross the line into dishonesty. In the corporate world, this line can blur rapidly. I once witnessed a senior executive during merger talks who kept talking about share values in public. At the same time, he was secretly planning major cost cuts that would mostly impact the staff of the company being acquired. Was he being deceitful? Or was this a calculated move to keep people calm until the deal was finalized? The employees who later lost their jobs certainly felt betrayed. The executive, though, called it a necessary part of the process. Both views make sense from different perspectives. Managing how others see us turns into manipulation when we do not just carefully select what we show, but also strategically hide facts to control the decisions others make. Even this definition starts to lose its clarity when examined closely. Think about strategic silence. Back in 2015, an internal investigation at a big financial company revealed that several mid-level managers knew about some questionable sales methods. However, they chose not to raise the alarm right away. Later, they claimed they were not sure about the evidence. Internal emails showed they hesitated, suggesting they wait for more proof. By staying silent, they protected their own reputations and avoided immediate problems. But this also allowed the harmful practices to continue. In this case, silence was a way of protecting themselves. For the customers, though, it made them complicit. Yet, sometimes silence is used as a defense. A junior employee who is quickly labeled as too emotional might purposely keep their reactions hidden during meetings to avoid confirming that stereotype. This silence is not about manipulating others. Rather, it is adapting to a negative situation. Withholding information can be a way to either protect oneself or manipulate others, depending on the situation and who has the power. Gaslighting is a clearer example of manipulation. In psychology, it means trying to make someone doubt their own perception of reality. Workplace case studies from the early 2000s show that some managers, when confronted with broken promises, would respond with things like, "That was never agreed upon," or "You are remembering it incorrectly." Over time, the people working under them reported feeling confused and unsure of themselves. Here, the goal is not just to influence how things are seen, but to shake someone's sense of reality. It turns how one perceives things into a weapon. However, not all control over perception is so obvious. Emotional signals can be tricky. Research on political communication has found that showing controlled anger can make supporters see a leader as stronger. During important press conferences, leaders often look serious and pause before speaking. These are planned actions that show the gravity of the situation. When the emotion matches the message, nobody really objects. But when emotion is faked to gain loyalty or create fear, most will hesitate to call it manipulation because some level of performance is expected from leaders. Machiavelli's blunt observation comes to mind. People judge more by what they see than by what they touch. If you look at the substance, if this is true, then choosing not to manage appearances might not be morally pure, but rather strategically foolish. I once followed a mid-career professional trying to climb the ladder inside a multinational company. He started going to informal networking events, carefully sharing stories that showed how tough and loyal he was. He hardly ever brought up past disagreements. When asked about failures, he described them as learning experiences that solidified his commitment to the company's goals. Nothing he said was untrue, but it was not the whole story. Over time, senior leaders started describing him as in sync and stable. Colleagues who knew his ambitions privately called him calculating. In the end, he got promoted. Was he manipulating people or simply not showing vulnerabilities that could be used against him? The answer depends on whether truth means telling everything or giving an accurate picture. In most organizations, telling all can be penalized. Those who show too much complexity are seen as unpredictable. The ethical problem gets worse when perception control takes advantage of cognitive biases. Experiments in behavioral economics on anchoring show that people who are exposed to random high numbers tend to estimate higher values for unrelated things later. Sales professionals are taught to introduce a pricey option first, knowing it is likely to set expectations higher. Customers often sense this influence but cannot explain it. Is this persuasion or is it manipulation? The method relies on predictable mental shortcuts. It does not take away choice, but shapes the context in which choices are made. Subtle pressure works similarly in social climbing. I noticed a pattern among aspiring leaders at a consultancy firm. They would publicly agree with high-status mentors, subtly distance themselves from controversial figures, and imitate the language of those in power. This alignment signals loyalty and also discourages disagreement. Colleagues who did not imitate were described as independent, sometimes admiringly, but often skeptically. Eventually, the network reorganized itself around those who were good at playing this game. This is where theory falls short. Social psychologists describe impression management as normal behavior. Experts on organizations call it a political skill. Ethics scholars warn against deceit. But in reality, survival and manipulation use the same methods. The difference is in the intent and the impact, both of which are hard to judge from the outside. For those working under them, these dynamics feel very real. When a manager praises openness but only rewards those who bring good news, employees learn to be selective about what they reveal. When a leader publicly celebrates teamwork but secretly promotes those who are aggressively competitive, teams understand the contradiction. They adapt to it. The culture, then becomes a careful dance of half-truths. I was not expecting the line between protecting oneself and deceiving others to be so unclear. The theory of rational actors is not sufficient. People justify their framing strategies as necessary responses to unfair systems. Those hurt by these strategies experience them as a form of betrayal. If the world is swayed by perception, then managing perception is rational, but rational for whom? The one creating the frame, or the one living within it? And if refusing to shape perception leaves one vulnerable to those who do, is moral restraint a virtue, or just a luxury for those who already have power? If managing perception is rational, then the next question is brutal. Which emotion is best to use to shape it? Affection or caution? Loyalty or fear? Machiavelli answers without hesitation. It is safer to be feared than loved if one has to choose. Not because fear is noble, but because it is more reliable. Love is conditional and based on benefit, mood, and shared identity. Fear, when linked to clear boundaries, is reliable. I used to think this point of view was harsh. Then I began to see how authority actually stabilizes within modern organizations. Back in 2002, a study in the Journal of Applied Psychology looked at how people perceived leaders' warmth and skill. Leaders seen as highly skilled but only moderately warm were often considered effective and decisive. Leaders seen as warm but lacking strength had difficulty enforcing standards. The combination that created solid authority was not just likability, but controlled respect. Employees felt secure when expectations were clear and consequences were consistent. They felt anxious under leaders who switched between being friendly and being strict. First impressions are important here. The initial emotional association is likely to stick. I observed this at a logistics company where a newly promoted supervisor tried to start by being friendly. On his first day, he said he wanted to be one of the team. He avoided correcting mistakes in public and brushed off minor violations of the rules. Within weeks, deadlines were not being met. When he finally started enforcing penalties, the reaction was not compliance, but resentment. Employees saw him as inconsistent. His initial leniency had made him seem flexible. Every later attempt to assert authority felt like a betrayal. In contrast, think about another case at a manufacturing plant in 2017. A new plant manager began by personally checking safety protocols. In his first month, he stopped production after finding repeated violations, even though regional executives pressured him to keep output high. The decision cost the company revenue in the short term, and workers complained. However, they also noticed that the line was real. Later, when he requested overtime during a supply shortage, compliance was high. The initial action had combined caution with respect. He was not loved, but he was reliable. Research into dominant psychology sheds light on this pattern. Studies by Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado on social dominance orientation suggest that hierarchical systems are more stable when authority figures are seen as legitimately strong. Legitimacy reduces how often they are challenged. Weak signals at the beginning increase testing behavior. In lab experiments on group hierarchy formation, individuals who fail to assert their position early are more likely to face repeated status challenges, even if they show skill later. The first interaction sets the pecking order. This does not mean one needs to be overtly aggressive. The idea of fear in Machiavelli's sense is not about causing terror, but about clearly setting out consequences. The first emotional anchor can be quiet but firm. I once attended a board meeting where a chief executive, newly appointed after a scandal, was asked whether certain senior executives involved in the previous misconduct would remain. He paused, then stated calmly that accountability would be non-negotiable. Within 2 weeks, 2 executives had resigned. The message spread faster than any memo. Employees reported feeling uneasy, but also reassured. The leader's authority was established in that moment. If he had hesitated, offering vague statements about reviewing processes, speculation would have exploded. Authority might have dissolved into endless committee debates. The risk of starting with too much warmth is instability. Love changes with results. When quarterly results decline, affection disappears. Research on leader-member exchange theory shows that high relational closeness does not guarantee compliance under stress. In fact, when a leader who relies on personal rapport enforces unpopular decisions, followers experience sharper dissonance. I thought we were on the same side. Disappointment becomes personal. Fear, or more precisely, respect based on boundaries, is less emotionally volatile. It does not need constant reassurance. It needs consistency. Yet there is a cost. Leaders who anchor perception in fear must remain consistent. Inconsistency undermines deterrence. If a boundary is enforced once and then ignored later, testing resumes. Authority becomes expensive to maintain. For ordinary employees, these dynamics shape daily calculations. Under a leader seen as weak, informal power centers emerge. Senior staff bypass formal channels. Meetings become subtle arenas for defiance. Under a leader seen as firm, disagreement goes underground or becomes more structured. Neither environment is morally ideal, but one is more stable. I did not expect how often authority is decided in a single visible event. A refusal to tolerate disrespect in a meeting, a decision to fire a high performer who violates norms, or a public defense of a subordinate against unfair criticism. These moments create emotional memories. An emotional memory anchors hierarchy. Reputation here is not about being popular. It is about strategic defense. If the first association with a leadership style is ambiguity, leaders will spend months trying to repair it. If the first association is clear boundaries, many future conflicts will never appear. Machiavelli warned that fear must avoid hatred, which destabilizes and mobilizes resistance. The line between respect and resentment is thin and often misjudged. Modern leaders are taught to avoid fear completely, choosing inspiration instead. However, inspiration without enforceable limits becomes unreliable. So the dilemma sharpens. Is it better to be admired and repeatedly tested, or cautiously respected and rarely challenged? And once the first emotional anchor is set, how much effort will it take to move it? If authority hardens in one decisive moment, then reputation is not just how others see someone. It is the shield that determines whether they dare to push back. If authority can harden in a single decisive moment, then failure can do the same. The same mechanism that locks in respect can also lock in suspicion. The stakes become sharper because redemption is not symmetrical. Psychologists call this negativity bias. Back in 2001, Paul Rozin and Edward Roisman summarized decades of research showing that negative events carry more psychological weight than positive ones of equal intensity. In studies on impression formation, a single negative trait influences overall evaluation more strongly than a single positive trait. One accusation can overshadow 10 achievements. I remember thinking this sounded exaggerated. Then I started looking at scandal trajectories. Think about the case of Arthur Andersen in 2001. For decades, it was one of the most respected accounting firms worldwide. The Enron scandal did not just hurt its image, it erased the firm. Even though the United States Supreme Court later overturned the criminal conviction in 2005, the damage to its reputation was irreversible. Clients had already left, and employees had scattered. The first dominant narrative, complicity and fraud. This anchored perception. Legal nuance came too late. Trust asymmetry explains part of this. Research in organizational behavior suggests that trust builds gradually through repeated positive interactions, but can be destroyed quickly by a single violation. A study published in the Academy of Management Review in the early 2000s described trust as a fragile asset. It requires consistent signals, but is highly sensitive to breaches. In experimental games that model cooperation, participants reduce trust sharply after one defection, even when prior cooperation was consistent. Restoring trust requires multiple subsequent cooperative acts, and even then, suspicion lingers. For regular employees, this asymmetry feels personal. A manager who supports a team for years, but once fails to defend them in a critical meeting, may find that loyalty evaporates overnight. I watched this happen in a pharmaceutical company in 2016. A department head had a reputation for fairness. During a restructuring, he remained silent while upper management criticized his team's performance. The silence lasted less than 5 minutes. The memory lasted years. Team members later described that moment as the turning point. "That is when we understood," one of them told me. His prior advocacy did not disappear, but it was reinterpreted as strategic rather than sincere. Public figures face the same irreversibility on a larger scale. When a technology founder is first framed as visionary and later revealed to have manipulated data, the narrative does not revert to neutral. It swings towards cynicism. Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos was initially celebrated as a disruptive innovator. After investigative reporting exposed inconsistencies in 2015, the dominant frame became deception. Subsequent attempts to present nuance or context were processed through that lens. Even genuine efforts at defense were interpreted as further manipulation. Negative first impressions are especially adhesive because they signal threat. Evolutionary psychology offers one explanation. Failing to detect danger carries a higher cost than failing to detect opportunity. The mind prioritizes potential harm. The practical consequence in social systems is severe. Once perceived as untrustworthy, any ambiguous action confirms suspicion. Belief perseverance intensifies the effect. Even when exonerating evidence appears, people struggle to completely revise their judgments. Back in 1980, studies on misinformation showed that participants exposed to false allegations continued to rely on them in reasoning tasks even after receiving corrections. The correction reduced certainty, but rarely eliminated the influence. The first stain never fully disappears. I did not expect reputations to be so resistant to rehabilitation. Corporate crisis management firms promise recovery strategies, apology tours, rebranding campaigns, leadership changes. Sometimes these work partially. After the 2010 oil spill, BP invested heavily in environmental initiatives and marketing. Surveys showed gradual improvement in brand perception over years. But the association with environmental disaster remains embedded in public memory. Improvement does not equal erasure. The irreversibility principle operates quietly in everyday hierarchies. A new employee who makes a serious mistake in the first month may carry that shadow far longer than a colleague who makes an error later. Early errors shape baseline expectations. Later errors are contextualized. I have seen junior professionals overcorrect for a single public failure, working excessively, volunteering for difficult tasks, attempting to overwrite the narrative. Some succeed. Most exhaust themselves trying to outpace a label. Here, the Machiavellian dimension becomes unavoidable. If the first move sets the frame, and negative frames are especially durable, then timing is strategic defense. Preventing early damage to reputation is not about vanity. It is about protection. The logic is ruthless but consistent. Before perception hardens, influence is relatively inexpensive. After hardening, influence becomes costly and uncertain. Apologies must be repeated. Actions must be amplified. Transparency must be theatrical. Even then, skepticism shadows every gesture. This asymmetry explains why experienced leaders are hyper-attentive to first crises. They know that the initial public response to failure may define them more than the failure itself. Delay, denial, or defensiveness in those early hours can cement incompetence as identity. Swift acknowledgement and decisive correction can contain damage. The window is narrow. For subordinates, the lesson feels less strategic and more precarious. One visible misstep under a new manager can define an entire career trajectory within that team. The perception may never fully reset. Transfers, lateral moves, even company changes are sometimes attempts to escape a frozen narrative. I used to believe redemption was mainly achievable through effort and sincerity. The data suggests otherwise. Redemption is possible, but it is asymmetrical and slow. Permanence is the default, which makes the initial move in any social system disproportionately powerful. Before the first decisive act, a person is undefined, but after it, they are interpreted. And if the cost of early miscalculation is so high, then the real question is not how to repair a damaged image, but how much of your future freedom depends on what happens in those first, often underestimated moments. If the first move in any social system is disproportionately powerful, then communication becomes more than tactics. It becomes the core of leadership itself, and also the recognition that one's narrative can become a trap. At the individual level, this is called personal brand. Back in 2007, when Steve Jobs returned to the Apple stage to present the iPhone, the device was not yet dominant, nor even fully proven. What he controlled was the narrative, a revolutionary reinvention of the phone. Journalists repeated this framing. Consumers processed every later flaw like dropped calls, limited third-party apps within that myth of inevitability. The interpretation came before the proof. I did not fully appreciate this at the time. I thought product superiority would determine perception, but it rarely does on its own. Scaled upwards, and the same structure governs corporations. In 2009, after the financial crisis, Goldman Sachs was publicly labeled by a major magazine as the vampire squid. The metaphor stuck. Internal reforms, charitable initiatives, executive speeches were all filtered through that frame of predatory intelligence. Meanwhile, other banks with similar practices avoided such impactful metaphors and therefore faced softer public narratives. The difference was not solely behavior, but symbolic positioning at a critical narrative moment. Political systems operate on the same logic, only with greater consequences. Back in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural address framed the crisis not just as economic hardship, but as a test of national courage. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The phrase did not solve unemployment, but it reframed emotional interpretation. Subsequent policies were judged within a story of collective resilience. Contrast that with regimes where the first narrative centers on humiliation or betrayal. Later events are interpreted as confirmation of threat, and the frame becomes infrastructure. Media ecosystems amplify this effect. Studies on agenda-setting theory in the 1970s demonstrated that media does not tell people what to think, but what to think about. Later research refined the claim. Framing influences how issues are evaluated. When a protest is framed as civil unrest instead of as a civil rights demonstration, the same footage evokes different moral conclusions. The event does not change. Interpretation does. I have spoken with mid-level managers who feel trapped inside corporate mythologies. One described joining a multinational firm known internally as the meritocracy, where promotions in practice were influenced by alliances and informal sponsorship. Yet, because the founding narrative emphasized pure performance, employees blamed themselves for stalled advancement. The system did not need to openly suppress dissent. The myth processed disappointment into self-doubt, and individual independence shrank inside systemic interpretation. Reputation economies on social media make this even more visible. A creator labeled as authentic can make minor mistakes without losing followers. Missteps are framed as human. A creator labeled as calculated is punished for similar behavior because it confirms manipulation. Algorithms intensify early narratives, and engagement patterns in the first weeks of visibility determine distribution trajectories. The system rewards interpretive momentum. This is where the core thesis hardens, and I hesitate because it can sound harsher than most people are comfortable admitting. Power does not control reality so much as it controls interpretation of reality. Armies, budgets, technologies matter, but without narrative alignment, they fracture. Machiavelli understood this intuitively. Rulers, he wrote, must appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious, even if they are not. Few examine substance. Most judge by appearance. Psychology sometimes softens this into discussions of cognitive bias, but in practice, bias becomes policy. When institutions control the first narrative around an event that has occurred, a merger, a scandal, or a reform, they pre-structure how future evidence will be digested. If that merger is framed as strategic synergy, then layoffs are just seen as an unfortunate necessity. If the same merger is framed as a hostile takeover, then those resulting layoffs are seen as sheer predation. The data then enters a pre-established mold. I have seen employees argue with spreadsheets, trying to prove that leadership decisions are irrational. However, the numbers rarely win because the battle was not over data. It was over interpretive authority, which was established months earlier. Once a leadership team is perceived as visionary, setbacks are seen as strategic recalibrations. Once perceived as reckless, identical setbacks are just proof of incompetence. There is tension between individual independence and systemic control. People like to believe they assess facts independently. Experiments on confirmation bias reveal that individuals seek information that confirms prior beliefs. If the first narrative shapes belief, and belief shapes information processing, then the initial framing quietly governs the future. I did not expect how little overt direction is required once interpretation is stabilized. Systems do not need constant force. They simply need consistent stories. Personal brand becomes corporate brand. Corporate brand becomes political myth, and political myth becomes cultural common sense. At each layer, the mechanism is the same. Define the meaning before the evidence accumulates. Refusing to participate in perception management on principle is not opting out of the system, but one is simply allowing someone else to define the first narrative. And once that narrative hardens, even resistance will be interpreted through it. If the infrastructure is already built, then what remains is to see the blueprint clearly. Strip away the metaphors, the corporate stories, and the political myths. The pattern should become clear. In 1946, Solomon Asch demonstrated that a single adjective, such as warm or cold, inserted into an identical personality description radically altered how subjects evaluated the same person. That one word shifted the structure of judgment. And there is nothing special. People judge instantly because cognitive economy demands it. Daniel Kahneman formalized this as System 1 thinking, which is fast, automatic, and associative. In under a second, people categorize friend or threat, competent or incompetent, leader or subordinate. In hiring studies conducted at Princeton, researchers showed that participants formed competence judgment from faces in less than a second, and those snap judgments predicted real election outcomes with unsettling accuracy. Then comes the dominance of first information. In 1965, Edward Thorndike described the halo effect. Later experiments confirmed primacy bias. Information presented first disproportionately shapes evaluation. In negotiation simulations at Harvard, opening offers anchored entire bargaining ranges. Participants could not fully correct for anchoring. Influence was not neutralized. Updating is cognitively costly. Leonard Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance showed that contradictory evidence produces psychological discomfort. The belief perseverance studies demonstrated that subjects still clung to their original beliefs. Rewriting requires energy people reserve for survival, not social recalibration. Emotion cements perception. The response from Ledoux demonstrated that those responses can precede conscious reasoning. People have the tendency to encode caution before analysis begins. Some organizational behavior experts showed that there was a correlation to prolonged stress because those who were publicly embarrassed in meetings and later interactions became neutral. The tag became the lens to their memory. This shapes interpretation of all future behaviors and has some operationalized consequences. Some political thinkers showed statements activating reasoning for emotional regulation, not analytic reasoning. People rationalize inconsistency, and the followers need the story to be there. In conclusion, here's a step-by-step on how a logic emerges. The observer encounters a person. Then that person is categorized rapidly. The first refusal becomes the anchor. It attaches itself based on emotion. The observer stores an interpretation. As a result, the new evidence filters to maintain a connection from there on out. Then, this is where design meets drift. One director declined an unrealistic deadline without apologizes. The room shifted. He was not betrayed. He was stable. The manager agrees with the demand, and within weeks, he tried to correct them by imposing controls. His attempts turned to insecurity to those around him. He does not need continuous performance, but a structural way out and one signal that defines status. The narrative organizes interpretation. Finally, Machiavelli states that psychology states there's neural and support to his intuition because people rarely dive farther than what they see in front of them, so the appearances are a strategic position. There should not be a drift, or one will fall into a trap. The system will make sure to build a frame. The only thing is to make sure there is nothing that costs more to rewrite. If it still doesn't help, then rewrite the system.